Hello, I'm Wes Allen. The Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence started the What's a Preacher to Do interview series to discuss preaching in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. We've shifted gears, though, to discuss preaching that deals with racism due to the widespread response to the death of George Floyd. There's hope that as a culture, we may find ourselves at some kind of tipping point for dealing with at least some of the centuries-long history of racial oppression in our country, well, and beyond our country. So today we have with us Dr. Carolyn Helsel. She's an assistant professor of homiletics at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and she's written a great deal about helping the white church talk about racism. At the conclusion of the interview, we'll post some of Dr. Helsel's books on racism on screen so you can check them out for yourselves. So Carolyn, what's one key insight from your work that you think would be helpful to preachers these days?
The one key item I want preachers to focus on is story. I want preachers to think about the stories that their congregants are listening to related to racism. So for instance, if you get pushback after preaching a sermon that deals with anti-racism, go ahead and follow up with whatever parishioner sent you maybe a critical comment to ask what are the stories that they're listening to that informs their idea about racism. Because in our culture, we have competing stories. We have some stories that see racism as ongoing, as a continuing legacy of the injustice of the institution of slavery. And then we have other stories that are circulating through conservative media outlets that are saying things that racism today doesn't exist. Racism today is a farce on behalf of a few who are trying to gain more entitlements. So it's really important that we challenge these other narratives that are circulating and that we invite our congregants to share with us what are the stories that they're hearing and listening to that are driving their understanding of what racism means today.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I mean, preachers have long known the power of story in sermons. But I guess if we were having this conversation a century ago, even less, we'd be talking about building arguments to make your point in the sermon. But we've moved more towards narrative preaching in our culture. So how do you understand it functioning in the context of discussing racism? What's underneath stories that gives them the kind of power you want to use in addressing this topic?
One of the ways that stories function so powerfully is not only do they create meaning for us, they help us understand what's going on in the world, but they also create an emotional world for us. So for instance, persons that are hearing these competing narratives might be experiencing a lot of emotional discomfort at the rise of protesters around the country and around the world. And that discomfort makes them feel disoriented in the world where they felt like they knew what was right and what was wrong. They might be feeling guilt or shame or even feeling like they're ignorant or feeling stupid. There are a lot of feelings that can come up that people don't want to readily admit. So listening to some of these other stories that make sense of all of this in a way that assures you that, no, you're okay. No, you're not wrong. No, the world really is as you see it, has a very soothing effect on people's emotional world. So it's really important that we consider stories that help expand listeners' views of the world while also addressing those deep emotional needs to feel like they have a place in this world. So part of that involves assuring listeners that they too have been called by God into this work of anti-racism. They too have been called to make this world a better place. Whether they're young or old, God calls all people into this new work of kingdom building. And so helping attend to the emotions behind these stories, as well as giving listeners a sense that they too have been invited into this really important work.
Well, thank you for giving us a little bit of your time today. I really hope our viewers will check out your 3 books, one that deals with conversation generally about racism in the church, one that specifically deals with preaching, which is our interest in this, but your newest one that deals with having conversations with children about racism, tackling that early. Very timely work. Thank you for all you've done.
Thanks for having me.
Invite you all to keep attuned to this series. We'll have more authors and scholars talking about work on anti-racism in the pulpit.